Doctor Who has had a long and varied history, and as many people know, it is not just limited to the screen. Over the last 60 years, there has been hundreds of comics, audios, and books released. Overall, these can be a little bit intimidating to get into. So today, I'm going to be giving an overview of some of the different series of books published in relation to Doctor Who, and where you can jump in depending on your favourite Doctor or story types. There are a few series of books that I will not be talking about, unfortunately, because ultimately there are just so many that might overwhelm everything. Rest assured, however, that I plan to cover all of these in my pilgrimage series, which will have eventually covered everything possible related to Doctor Who. Fingers crossed, that is. So, let's get started. The Target novelizations. Back before the popularity of videos and DVDs, a lot of the early Doctor Who serials were not repeated. Therefore, if people wanted to relive the serials from the comfort of their own home, they turned to the novelizations. These were also the only way that many people at the time could experience these missing episodes. Target originally was a publishing imprint company focused on children's literature from the 1970s to the 1990s, and at the time they published both fiction and non-fiction. In 2018, the imprint was revived and the novelizations of the new series began too. By the time the original imprint ended, they had novelised every first, second, and third and seventh Doctor story that had aired on TV, and by 2022, they had published every single story from 1963 to 1996, as well as 9 stories from the new series. The first stories that were published came in the mid-60s with Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks and Doctor Who and the Crusaders, both by David Whittaker, as well as Doctor Who and the Zarbi by Bill Strutton. It took until the 1970s before more actually materialised. Terence Dicks was the first to publish under the Target imprint with the Doctor Who and the Auton invasion. Dicks would end up writing a lot of the novelisation and becomes more famously known for them. The novelizations are known for changing or building upon the story itself, with a number of novels changing and ignoring previous stories in the early years. Those that were written by the original authors of the serial added more context and rich world building that adds a lot to the original story, making them fascinating glimpse into the world of Doctor Who that was not, unfortunately, able to be shown on screen. So, what ones are good to get started with? Well, the novelizations are in a unique one in this category because it doesn't really matter where you start. You can jump in pretty much anywhere you like with any story, whatever one interests you with it, whatever Doctor you want to. Here are a couple ones that I and a couple of friends suggest reading. Doctor Who and an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks. So this was recently renamed to just be Doctor Who and the Daleks, similar to the serial being renamed The Mutants after now being called the Daleks. This was the very first novelisation ever released, and it was published less than a year after Doctor Who started airing. It was written by David Whittaker, and in the late 1970s, High Sales launched the entire novelisation range. Interestingly, it retcons the serial An Unearthly Child and is told from the perspective of Ian. It also has some of the first unique illustrations from the Target range, and the audiobook of the novelisation is read by William Russell. Recently, a fully illustrated version of this story has been released using some of the old and new illustrations and can be found anywhere, and it's quite beautiful, so I would recommend having a look at that if you would like some prettier ones to go along with it. Doctor Who and the Auton invasion. This was the first original novelisation released in the 70s, and it was written by Terence Dicks. Dicks was famous for his ties to the Target range, and this is where it all started for him. It was an adaptation of the first Third Doctor serial, Spearhead from Space, and the audiobook was read by Carolyn John. It also adapts the last few scenes from the previous serial, The War Games, and the regeneration of the Second Doctor into the Third. Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowman. This adaptation has been highly praised and has been recommended to me on numerous different occasions. This is another one written by Terence Dicks, and the audiobook was read by David Troughton. Some people have also said that this book was better than the original serial, which you'll have to go away and see for yourself. The TV movie. The novelisation of the TV movie first came out in 1996, not too long after the film itself, but an expanded version came out in 2021. It was written by Gary Russell and the audiobook was read by Dan Starkey. The original novelisation was based off of an early script, so has quite a few deviations from the film and is great for seeing the difference in different results of studio changes. The Day of the Doctor. My personal favourite Target novelisation is that of The Day of the Doctor, written by Stephen Moffat, who also penned the episode of the same name. It adds a lot of depth to the original story and incorporates different Doctor perspectives effortlessly. The portrayal of the Time War, I think, was a lot better on page than it was on screen, and it adds a nice sort of sprinkling to the story. It adds scenes that were not in the episode either, and all in all, I think this is the novelisation that shows that what this range is really for, or famous for, building on and expanding on the stories shown in TV. Recently, in honour of Terrance Dicks, they also released 2 volumes, the Terrance Dicks Essential Volumes 1 and 2, which has a number of different novelisations and are perfect places for jumping on points. The Virgin New Adventures. After Doctor Who went off air in 1989, there was a gap in the market. No one was telling any new Doctor Who stories, so Virgin Books set up a novel series which continued the adventures of the 7th Doctor and Ace after the final serial, Survival. It ran for 8 years in total and added some of the most iconic Wilderness Years characters, including my personal favourite, Bernice Summerfield. All of them feature the 7th Doctor, but do not require a whole lot of context from his seasons. However, it does add a lot to the story, knowing some of the kind of serials that were referenced from time to time. They are not child-friendly, however, as they were designed for an adult audience and have a lot of new themes which often were not explored in the TV series. The quality of these ones vary a lot compared to other series, so here are a couple of ones that I would personally recommend, or some nice jumping on points if you want to kind of read the whole stuff. Love and War. Love and War is the 9th book in the range. It was written by Paul Cornell and introduces the iconic Bernice Summerfield. Now, you might be wondering, what about the first 8? In my personal opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinion, the first 8 aren't exactly a good introduction to the range, so a lot of people just recommend starting with Love and War because it's a good jumping on point. It's a good example of the more mature themes of this series and explores further the more manipulative nature of the 7th Doctor towards Ace and then the fallout surrounding that. Out of the first 10, actually, I think it was the best, and a very good jumping on point because from this point on, a lot of the companions are just Benny. Theatre of War. The 26th novel in this series is Theatre of War and is my favourite novel of the entire Virgin New Adventures range. Benny, Ace and the 7th Doctor are exploring Benny's newest archaeological dig when they get involved in a mysterious interstellar war. Bernice Summerfield travels to the Braxytel collection to do some research and meets Irving Braxytel himself. Brax as a character is wonderful and it's just so rich in world building and interstellar politics, it's just fantastic. Further books would adapt more of Benny's and Irving's relationship, and that's like the most important part of Doctor Who for me is them two. So that's maybe a little bit biased. All-Consuming Fire. The next book is a nice little standalone novel which features Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, and it's set up as if it was an original Sherlock Holmes story, narrated by Watson and featuring classic Doctor Who shenanigans. It is a fun, if somewhat dark, romp, perfect if you want to try out the range with very little context and a little bit of familiarity with characters such as Holmes and Watson, and it just has a very, very good adaptation by Big Finish later in the noughties, I believe. Human Nature. In Series 2 of the new series, Paul Cornell wrote a 2-part story called Human Nature and the Family of Blood. This was adapted from the novel, featuring the 7th Doctor and Benny, instead of the 10th Doctor and Martha. It's a broadly similar story but focuses on the darker incarnation of the Seventh Doctor and has a lot more heavy themes surrounding pre-war Britain and the mentality of a lot of people in that era. If you enjoyed that episode and series, I would highly recommend reading this one, as the inspiration is fantastic to experience. Lung Barrow. Ooh. Now, this is perhaps one of the most infamous Doctor Who novels ever, and perhaps also one of the rarest. If you ever heard of the Time Lords reproducing through looms, this is the book that it comes from. It is extremely heavy on the lore and context, and a little bit iffy on the plot. So it's not for the faint of heart, but it's a very, very bizarre novel that you might get something out of if you enjoy that sort of thing. The Eighth Doctor Adventures. After the 1996 TV movie came out, the current range of Doctor Who books shifted from the 7th Doctor to the 8th Doctor. It ran for 8 years until the launch of the new series. It did not have the same levels of mature themes as the Virgin New Adventures, but did have a significantly better representation of sexual and gender identities, including exploring the Doctor's relationship to gender itself. These are much more difficult to just jump into, unfortunately, as they are known for their long and complicated story arcs, which last over many different books. However, I will try sprinkling in a couple of that I think that are good and do not require that much context. Vampire Science. This is the second novel in the 8th Doctor Adventure range, but as the first, the 8th Doctor is not overly highly regarded. This is where most people recommend starting. It was written by Kate Orman and Jonathan Blum. Kate Orman is, in my opinion, one of the best Doctor Who writers out there, so for that reason alone, I would recommend this book. It fleshes out the new companion of Sam Jones and toys with the idea of vampires, old enemies of the Time Lords. The Scarlet Empress. The Scarlet Empress is the 15th novel in the EDAs and is the first novel appearance of the Time Lady Iris Welding, who travels around the universe causing chaos in a red double-decker bus. It is a very, very fun romp and parodies Doctor Who effortlessly, so if you're kind of wanting a light-hearted one, this is the one for you. The Crypt World. This novel takes place in the Crypt World, which is a love letter in a way to cartoons such as Scooby-Doo and Tom and Jerry. It was written by Steve Lyons and features Fitz and Angie as the companions. This is the 57th novel in the series, so it does have quite a few connections, but the nature of the homages makes it a very fun and light-hearted read. Fitz is the companion for most of the EDAs and is interesting as a companion that gets a little bit of the crush, reciprocated or not, on the Doctor. He is wonderful as a companion and I'm sure that you'll absolutely love him. The new series adventures. So once the new series started up in 2005, another series of books began to be published to run alongside them. All of these books are standalone and can be read completely in random order, so sometimes with these ones it's just good to pick and choose whatever one tickles your fancy at the time. For the first time in this novel ranges, the authors actually tried to keep into ties with the TV continuity, which is quite fun as there's some nice Easter eggs out there for the eagle-eyed. The Clockwork Man. The first novel in the new range was written by Justin Richards and featured the Ninth Doctor and Rose. It was set in 1920s London and is a Doctor Who spin on the classic murder mystery. There are a couple of nice nods to the ongoing arc in the TV show, Bad Wolf, and helped set the tone for future books that were going to be published in that range. So it's nice to see where everything came from and where it kind of picked up from. Martha in the Mirror. This was the 22nd novel in the series, featuring Martha, surprisingly, and the 10th Doctor. It was also written by Justin Richards, and the only reason I added it to this list was because this was the very first Doctor Who book that I ever read. Since then, it has lived completely rent-free in my mind, completely. It's a ghost story wrapped up in a political war thriller with mirrors and books, and overall, just an extremely fun ride. I would highly recommend this one. Like I said, I don't even know if it's that good necessarily. It just captured the part of my mind that I loved. And I really like Justin Richards as a writer, so I feel like it works well here. Big Bang Generation. Now, not to keep banging on about her, but this novel is another one to feature Bernice Summerfield. This time it's with the 12th Doctor. It also features some of Bernie's companions, but you don't actually need to know too much of the context surrounding this one to enjoy it. It was written by Gary Russell and bridges the two different series ongoing of Benny and Doctor Who perfectly, and it kind of lines up, and it's just a nice kind of glimpse into both of them and how they kind of cross paths. At Childhood's End. If you want a more up-to-date and recently released novel, then you'll want At Childhood's End. There haven't been much books set in the 13th Doctor era, but this is one that I really enjoyed, even though it messes with a lot of different continuity and whatnot. It was written by Sophie Aldred, Mike Tucker, and Steve Cole, and it is a story where the 13th Doctor, Graham, Yaz, and Ryan meet up with Ace after there are some strange going-ons in 2020 London. It's very fun and works well as both an exploration of the Seventh Doctor's manipulation of Ace and how Ace works with that when confronted with another Doctor. It's also a nice precursor or complement to the episode Power of the Doctor, which came out a mere 2 years later. The Virgin Missing Adventures and the Past Doctors. I am grouping these ones together because they are pretty much the same sort of series of books. During the main run of the Virgin New Adventures and the 80th Doctor Adventures, both Virgin and the BBC did a similar run featuring every other Doctor. These were called the Virgin Missing Adventures and the Past Doctor Adventures, respectively. The Virgin Missing Adventures followed the same route as having more mature themes in the original show, but the PDAs went a more tame approach and kind of went along the same lines as the EDAs at the time. All of these are also standalone, but have a lot of crossover with other ranges at the time, so just be careful of that if you're going to try and read them in order. So let's start with Cold Fusion. Cold Fusion was the 25th novel in the Virgin Missing Adventures. It was written by Lance Parkin and as a crossover between the Missing Adventures and the New Adventures, featuring the 5th Doctor and the 7th Doctor. It was designed to complement the publication So Vile a Sin from the VNA range, and although a lot of people didn't realise that at the time, so had a lot of context missing when trying to read So Vile a Sin. It also has some links to other Lance Parkin works that he wrote for Doctor Who. It builds a lot on the lore of Gallifrey, and especially to do with things including Time War and people called Patience and all that sort of thing. But it'll make more sense when you get into it, so do be aware of that. The Infinity Doctors. So, the Past Doctor range celebrated the 35th anniversary of Doctor Who with this novel. It was also written by Lance Parkin. If you don't realise by now, him and Mark Platt are quite often known for building on the lore of Gallifrey. It features an unknown incarnation of the Doctor and is set in almost entirely on Gallifrey itself, with heavy lore and references to other appearances of Gallifrey, both in novels and the TV show. It's a bit of an interesting one, but if you're into world building, then you might like this one. Now, there are loads of other ranges out there, such as Torchwood, Sarah Jane, etc, 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 but I'm going to leave it there for today. If you want a guide on a little bit more of the ranges, let me know, because I'll be happy to do it. I also kind of want to do one of these for comics and for audios. Thank you for all the support in the most recent videos, and I will try and get my next couple of ones up as soon as possible. If you like it, please do subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye bye!